And about 3 years ago, I went public with my theory of the two communist parties of the United States. And it really was not a theory, it was a political observation which I had made over a number of years, and I finally put it all together, and I realized that since 1933, the Democratic Party of the United States had been totally taken over by the Stalinist wing of the Communist Party. And of course you had Bella Moskowitz, who masterminded the entire Roosevelt campaign for the presidency, and then she died suddenly just before Roosevelt was inaugurated, and her place as head of the Harold Ware cell of communist espionage agents in Washington was taken over by Felix Frankfurter, who was then dean of the law school at Harvard University, and who had been denounced by Franklin D. Roosevelt's cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, as the most dangerous revolutionary in the United States. And I guess Franklin deliberately hired Felix Frankfurter because he and Theodore Roosevelt, of course, never agreed on the communist movement. Theodore Roosevelt was very anti-communist all his life. And even though Theodore Roosevelt, unfortunately, was responsible for Woodrow Wilson being elected as President of the United States. And I come from Stanton, Virginia, and from my bedroom window, I look across to the next hill, and that is the manse where Woodrow Wilson was born. His father was minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Stanton at the time Woodrow Wilson was born, and then he was transferred to Georgia when Woodrow Wilson was 3 months old. But of course Woodrow Wilson has always been known as having been born in Stanton, Virginia. And so when they had chosen Woodrow Wilson to become the Democratic candidate for the President of the United States in 1912, they realized that he was not a popular candidate. He had about as much charisma as a piece of dry toast, and so and they had a president, a Republican president, who was very popular, named William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft was an enormously fat, cheerful guy, and he was well liked. So they had a real problem. How could they elect Woodrow Wilson? They wanted to elect him to sign the Federal Reserve Act into law. How could they elect this Democratic candidate who had no public appeal against a incumbent who had great personal appeal? So they decided that the only strategy they could use was to split the Republican Party. And they did this by resuscitating Theodore Roosevelt, whose political career was pretty much over at that point. He also had been a popular president, but he was no longer considered a viable candidate, and especially because they were very satisfied with the way Taft was serving in the White House. So they revived Theodore Roosevelt and ran him as a bull moose candidate to split the Republican Party and ensure the election of Woodrow Wilson. Now there was another angle of this also, because the Jewish bankers led by Jacob Schiff had gone to President Taft several years before, and this is according to the letters of Archie Butt, who was President Taft's personal aide. He published his journals later, and he mentioned in there that Jacob Schiff had led this delegation of Jews to the White House and demanded that President Roosevelt issue a strong denunciation of the Tsar of Russia because of the alleged pogroms against the Jews and repressive measures against the Jews which were taking place in Russia. And Theodore Roosevelt told him that he sympathized with whatever problems the Jews were having in Russia, but that the United States had no authority to intervene in the internal affairs of another country, particularly a friendly country, and Russia, of course, was very friendly to the United States at that time. And because Taft refused to do this, Jacob Schiff and the Rothschilds chose Taft as someone to be kicked out of office, and this is another reason why they brought in Theodore Roosevelt. And he split the Republican Party, and of course Taft was defeated, and Woodrow Wilson went in by a landslide, and Theodore Roosevelt did not make much of a showing himself, but he made enough to make sure that Woodrow Wilson was elected president. So then, of course, Woodrow Wilson duly signed the Federal Reserve Act on December the 23rd, 1913, and put us in the power of the House of Rothschild, because he gave the bankers a monopoly of all the money and all the credit of all the people of the United States, and they have maintained that monopoly ever since 1914 when they set up business. So this was the inside story of how Woodrow Wilson became president, and then of course after him we had Republican presidents through the 1920s, which were a period of prosperity and economic growth for the American people. And then of course you had the artificially engineered stock market crash of 1929, Black Friday, and this was done by the classic banker's technique of international gold movements, which at that time were pretty much in the charge of a banking house called Lazard Brothers, Lazard Frères of New York and Paris. And by shipping the gold back and forth, they created an artificial shortage of short-term call money, and this, of course, precipitated the crash and the Great Depression. And this was all deliberately engineered, not only for profit, but also for political goals, because Herbert Hoover, there was no way he could be reelected against this background of economic depression. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt swept into the White House, and the first thing he did was to recognize the Stalinist regime in Russia, the Soviet. And this was because his entire personal staff was composed of the Harold Ware cell of communists, which was a fanatical Stalinist group. Well, then in 1940, Stalin had exiled Leon Trotsky in Russia. Leon Trotsky, of course, was the real architect of the successful communist revolution. He originated the Red Army, and he ran it, and he was a mass murderer. He murdered many thousands, perhaps millions of Russians, mostly Christians, and inaugurated a reign of terror in Russia. But he did not have the bureaucratic ability to run the government. He was a demagogue, and he loved to get out and make fiery speeches, but when it came to sitting in the offices and doing the daily work, Trotsky simply was not cut out for it. And so he continued to be a revolutionary after he had won over the country. And he was the dictator of Russia, he and Lenin. And so then Lenin died, supposedly poisoned by Stalin, which seems to be very likely, because he had one, Stalin had one henchman named Yagoda, who later became head of the LGPU, the Russian terrorist police. And Yagoda supposedly had the formulas of 57 different compounds which could be administered to a person to bring on a fatal heart attack, and which would show absolutely no residue. There's no way that you could test and find any of these compounds. So Lenin apparently was a victim of one of these compounds, and Stalin then produced a letter claiming that Lenin had chosen him as his heir, which Trotsky knew this was a forged letter, and it made him furious, but he really couldn't disprove it. And so he wound up being exiled, and then, of course, on the eve of the Second World War, Stalin decided that he could not afford to have Trotsky running around the world stirring up agitation against him, so he sent a man over to Mexico City to put an ice axe into Trotsky's head and kill him. So now the two wings of the world communist movement, the Stalinist wing and the Trotskyite wing, continued to be in conflict, and the Trotskyite wing, of course, now had a martyr, which meant that their followers were even more dedicated than ever. And the Trotskyite wing of the Communist Party was headquartered in New York City, and of course they were well financed because you had the Rothschilds, you had other bankers who financed them, and they had plenty of money to maintain publications, office headquarters, staffs, and so forth. So they continued to be a very vocal group, but they had no political power in this country because the Stalinists were in total control of the Democratic Party in Washington, and therefore the Stalinists were running the United States They called it the New Deal, but it was actually the Stalinist deal because this was Stalin's cohorts who were running his country under Roosevelt. So this situation continued until 1980 because the Trotskyists, they changed their stripes somewhat. They began to call themselves neoconservatives, and they were very vocally anti-communist. And so the American people said, my gosh, here are these Jews in New York, and they're very anti-communist, and so we should work with them. These are the kind of people we want to be in contact with. And so many good Americans were tricked by these Trotskyites, and they became very impressed by the work that they were doing, thinking they were sincere anti-communists when they were total communists all along, but they were Trotskyites who were fighting the Stalinists in Washington. So their moment came in 1980 when Reagan and Bush came into the White House, and as I say, that campaign was financed by the Bechtel Corporation, Schroeder Rockefeller interests, but the staff was drawn from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. And the Hoover Institution had a very interesting origin in that Herbert Hoover had set this up also as a supposedly anti-communist group. And but the interesting thing about this was that when the Bolshevik regime was ready to collapse in 1917, shortly after they came into power, they had no food, they had no money, and they really had no popular support. They existed only by terrorism, by massacring anybody who criticized them. So they were winning as far as massacring all their opponents, but they still had no food and no money. So naturally they notified New York that, look, we're on the verge of collapse, so we have no food and no money. So New York wired back, well, we'll take care of both of that problems. So as far as the money was concerned, they were able to advance money. They took $20 million from President Woodrow Wilson's personal fund of $100 million, which had been voted him by Congress as his special war fund to prosecute the First World War. $20 million of that in cash was taken to Russia by former Secretary of State Elihu Root. Elihu Root also is the man who wrote the charters for all of the big tax-exempt corporations like the Brookings Institution, Rockefeller Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, and these two became the principal vehicles of communism in the United States. So Elihu Root delivered this $20 million of emergency money to the Bolsheviks in Russia, and then they said, well, how about the food? And they said, we've got the greatest food expert in the world, a man who can bring you the food, and this was Herbert Hoover, the great engineer. And so Herbert Hoover brought the food to Russia in 1919, 1920, and saved the Bolshevik regime from total collapse. And yet, for the rest of his life, Herbert Hoover was known as a great anti-communist, a free enterprise man. And this just shows you how things can be perverted in the public mind through deliberate disinformation and propaganda and control of the mass media. Because during the years, for the rest of his life, Herbert Hoover posed as a great anti-communist, and no one, during that entire time, no scholar, no journalist, no investigator ever mentioned the uncomfortable fact that he was the one who saved the Bolshevik revolution from extinction. So, as I say, these neoconservatives had nested in Herbert Hoover's legacy, which was the Hoover Institute, supposedly very conservative, very anti-communist at Stanford University. And the origins of the Hoover Institute were very interesting because at the conclusion of the First World War, the House of Rothschild said, my gosh, you know, our paper trail is pretty bad here. It shows that we set up this whole war for our profit, and we've got to go into all the countries and get the records of our bribery and corruption of officials in order to bring about the First World War. So Hoover was given that assignment, and he had over 500 American Army officers traveling all over Europe and buying or stealing or appropriating all of these documents which showed the real origins of the First World War and the Rothschilds' guilt in setting up that war. And these documents were brought back to this country, and they were placed in the Hoover Institution for Revolution, War, and Peace in Stanford University. And he built a big building out there, and the building is there today. And most of these things were sealed. They were not available to scholars. So this is exactly what the Rothschilds wanted. And the reason they had chosen Hoover for this vital mission was that Hoover was a longtime Rothschild employee. This also, I don't think, has ever been mentioned in any biography of Herbert Hoover. And when I used to visit Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., he mentioned the fact that Hoover had been barred from dealing on the London Stock Exchange. You know, Hoover never had a job in the United States. He traveled the world for years promoting phony mining stocks in Australia and Africa and South America. And he did make a fortune, and he was made a lot of money in London. But then he swindled a man out of 5,000 pounds, $25,000, which is, you know, about $1 million in today's money. This was in 1905. And so he was permanently barred from any further dealings on the London Stock Exchange. So he was temporarily out of a job. So the Rothschilds said, my gosh, here's the kind of guy we want working for us. And so they hired him at Rio Tinto Zinc, which is one of the three main Rothschild enterprises. The other two are Sun Alliance and the Bank of England. And in the same issue of The Economist that I mentioned that I read yesterday, there was a 2-page spread advertisement from Sun Alliance mentioning that they lost $500 million in their current year of operations. So apparently the Rothschilds are milking that just like they milk everything else, and they've probably sold the stock to the public, and now it's going bankrupt. But anyway, real RTZ it's called today. It's traded on the London Stock Exchange as RTZ Corporation. It's very big. Rio Tinto Zinc was one of the main Rothschild enterprises, and they made Herbert Hoover a director of Rio Tinto Zinc in 1905 after he was barred from dealing on the London Stock Exchange. And of course, he was a Rothschild employee ever afterwards. And when Germany tried to quit in 1916, they had the same problem that the Bolsheviks were to have in the following year. They raised the cry that we have no more food and we have no more money, we can't keep the war going anymore, so we're going to seek an armistice. And of course, the world order did not want this because they hadn't even gotten the United States into the war yet. And our whole government since 1917 has been built on the force that Bernard Baruch set up in Washington in 1916 to run. Had to get the United States into the war, and they could not allow Germany to seek an armistice in 1916. So they said, well, we'll take care of the money, because Paul Warburg was governor of the Federal Reserve Board in charge of the money and credit of the United States at the same time that we were at war with Germany, and his brother Max Warburg was the financial advisor to the Kaiser and was in charge of German finances. So the Warburgs fixed up a fund of money to keep Germany in the war, but they said, now we have no food, what are we going to do about that? So that's when the Rothschilds had Herbert Hoover organize a relief commission. Well, they couldn't very well call it the German Relief Commission since the Allied powers were at war with Germany, so they called it the Belgian Relief Commission, and they put out the propaganda that the Belgians had famine and they were starving, and we had to help the Belgians. Well, the Belgians were very surprised at this revelation because they just had one of the best harvests they ever had, one of the best crop years, and so, but you know, because the Rothschilds had their headquarters in Belgium, the Belgians couldn't say too much about this, and apparently no one wanted to protest and say, well, we're not starving. And so the shiploads of wheat went to Europe from the United States, bought by the contributions of the American people for the starving Belgians, and when they got to Belgium, they were unloaded and they were shipped by train directly into Germany, and they kept Germany in the war another 2 years, and that's how we got into World War I. Otherwise, there would have been no World War I veterans of the United States because we would never have been in it. And then the Germans finally had to seek an armistice in 1918, but by that time the Rothschilds' purposes, the world order, they had achieved their goals, and they had set up a super government in Washington under Bernard Baruch and Eugene Meyer. And Baruch became head of the War Industries Board, was appointed by Woodrow Wilson, which made him the czar of all American industry. He could issue any order to any factory in the United States, and if that factory did not obey Baruch's dictate, then federal government would close them down immediately. And Baruch had a partner in a venture called the Alaska Juneau Gold Mining Company, and Meyer and Baruch were in charge of this operation, and it was another mining scheme such as the ones which were promoted by Herbert Hoover. And so when Baruch became head of the War Industries Board, he told Wilson, he said, well, you got to have somebody in charge of selling war bonds, the Liberty loans, and so I suggest my partner, Eugene Meyer. So, of course, Wilson obliged, and Eugene Meyer became head of the War Finance Corporation. And since he was in complete charge of printing all the bonds which were sold as Liberty bonds in the First World War, he decided, well, I don't see why, since I have total power here, I'll just print up two sets of all the bonds. One set for the government, one set for myself. So that's what he did. And, of course, he came out of the World War with an enormous fortune because he had printed and sold on Wall Street these duplicate bonds, and this was all recorded, by the way. And it came up in his later hearings to become Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Herbert Hoover decided to appoint Eugene Meyer to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and so the Congress had hearings on this, and during these hearings, Congressman Lewis McFadden, who later died mysteriously, suddenly, in 1936, after demanding the impeachment of Herbert Hoover and the entire Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Lewis McFadden had read into the records the fact that these bonds had been printed in duplicate by Eugene Meyer, and even though this was public at that time, the Washington Press, of course, did not ever mention the fact. And later on, Eugene Meyer used the money that he got from the sale of those bonds to buy the Washington Post, which is today one of the biggest corporations in the country and one of the biggest media conglomerates. And of course, he paid cash for it because he had plenty of cash.